Hey, and welcome back. It's been a minute since I've done one of these vlog style videos, so I figured this would be a great opportunity to bring you along at what looks to be a pretty jam-packed week in my career as a freelance musician. I wouldn't describe this specific week as typical, especially as it's just getting to the beginning of winter, and that's when my schedule usually slows down for a bit. But I'm excited to be rejoining forces with Jason Gessel, along with the rest of the Jazzernauts crew, for a couple shows, along with a few days in the studio to record some new music. If you've followed my channel for some time, you may have seen my video about the first album we recorded last fall in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and then a follow-up video from earlier this summer where we had a quick tour to finally celebrate the release of this album. Over the last few months, Jason has been planning and coordinating this week for us to get together to record and perform. And over the weekend, I got an email with the final itinerary, along with charts and demos for the new music we'll be recording. But on top of this reunion for the Jazzernauts crew, I also have some other performances, along with what more typically fills up my schedule during the week, lessons. It's currently Monday morning, and I need to head over to the studio today around noon to bring in my drums, set up, and go over a few things with Jason. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I just mentioned, I need to bring a set of drums over to Jason's studio for this session, and I decided to grab my trusty Gretsch New Classic bop kit. On the previous Jazzernauts record, I used a bop kit that I built myself, and I thought the drum tones were great, but there's nothing like a Gretsch kit under mics, and since we have some other gigs this week, I'd much rather have that compact kit I built myself to haul around for those performances. The same goes for hardware, since I'll need a set for my gigs, and I'd much rather have the lighter weight hardware that's already packed away in a bag to bring back and forth to gigs, so I'll need to rob some stands from the second kit that I usually leave set up in my studio. Cymbals are easy enough to bring back and forth from the studio to gigs, but I also made sure to grab this effects cymbal with rivets because it's quickly becoming one of my favorites to use on recordings. So with everything picked out to bring, I could go ahead and pack the hardware into my other hardware bag, and this is a great reminder of why I absolutely love my lightweight hardware. When this bag is full of standard hardware, it weighs a ton, and it's no fun to move up the stairs or load into the back of my car. Since I'm only heading a few miles down the road, I didn't waste time hauling out my drum cases, but if I were taking these drums out multiple times a week, I'd probably go ahead and use the cases to protect the shells. Right around noon, I hit the road to meet Jason at the studio. This studio is a brand new spot in Oshkosh that Jason and a few other partners are putting together, and this Jazernaut session will be the first recording in here, so it's cool that I get to document all that in this video here.
Window cleaning.
Looks pretty dirty still. The space actually used to be a recording studio way back in the day, so you'll see normal studio features like a large glass window between the control and live room, and an isolation booth that we'll be using for the drums. It's certainly not in its final form, but I respect Jason for not letting that hold him up from getting going with making music in here, and I'm sure this week will be much of a learning experience, as much as it is a session to capture new music. After getting some help with loading in my drums, I set up in the ISO booth, and we made some adjustments with the drum placement and sound panels to help dial in the tone in the room. Around 1:30, I made my way back home to get some other work done, like prepping charts for other gigs coming up this week, and sending some emails to musicians with information about those performances. I also needed to pack up my other set of drums for a gig I had tonight with a big band that I co-lead. Obviously, it'd be nice to not have to do this so early with the weather, but since I had a full slate of lessons coming up this afternoon, I knew I wouldn't have any time to do it later. On most weekdays, once 4 o'clock hits, I start teaching lessons. These are typically half-hour slots, and I'll teach somewhere between 5 and 7 lessons, going till around 7 p.m. This is really the most consistent work I have, and working out of my home makes it very convenient. I'm also lucky that I work with great students and families who are supportive of my career as a performer and are flexible when I have opportunities like this week where I'm unavailable for lessons due to recording and performing. On this night, my last lesson wrapped up at 7 p.m., and with the downbeat for my gig in just 60 minutes, I smartly ordered a sub ahead so I could grab it on my way out the door and eat it on the drive over to the gig. This performance that I'm doing tonight is one that I do once a month on a Monday with a sight-reading big band that I co-lead with a trumpet player. We've been doing this for just about 9 years at this point, and even though it can be stressful to organize and coordinate, I always love the opportunity to play with a traditional big band and keep my chart reading skills sharp. The theme for tonight's show was Latin, so you'll see we had to squeeze some extra room on stage for a percussionist, but that was absolutely worth it. Typically we play one 90-minute set on these shows, and there's always a great hang after the band gets done. With the show ending around 9:30, I always tell myself, and my wife, that I'll probably be home by 10:30, but honestly on most of these nights, I end up getting home more like 11 or 11:30. Luckily, I only live a mile or two away, so the commute couldn't be any easier, but once I got home, I went ahead and unloaded everything and got it put away. In the warmer months, I take no shame in leaving equipment in my car overnight, but during the winter months, it's just not good for the drums to be left out in the cold. But after everything was put away, it was time to call it a night. I had a few hours to myself from when I woke up before I needed to leave and head over to the studio, but I left my house just before 11 a.m., so I could get to the studio with plenty of time prior to the arrival of the other musicians coming in from out of town. Over the last day and night, Jason and the engineer took some time to set up the studio and run cables and mics everywhere, but we still needed to get levels on the drums, so we took some time to do this before our pianist and bass player got in at noon. For this session, they decided to go for a lighter setup on the drums, so it's just a stereo pair of overheads, and then close mics on the bass and snare drum. I like this sort of setup because it allows me as the musician to control most of my dynamics between my limbs and each voice of the kit, and it's a bit more in line with the great jazz recordings of the 50s and 60s. Like I just mentioned, our bassist and pianist traveled in this morning from across the state, so once they arrived at noon, we were able to get them mic'd up and got everyone settled with a good headphone mix prior to starting our rehearsal. Over the next 4 hours or so, we spent time going over all the music we'd be recording for this session. Out of the 8 tunes set to be part of this new recording, we had performed 3 of them previously while on tour this summer, so the arrangements and structure were pretty familiar to all of us, but the remaining 5 tunes were all new to this group. A lot of these tunes have previously been recorded by the duo Jason has with his wife, Sunday and Mr. Gessel, but from what Jason told us, these tunes were originally wrote instrumentally, and then he worked with his wife to add lyrics, so it was a cool experience to be able to go back and play these tunes in their original format while experiencing a new timbre and feel to the music being played by a different instrumentation and ensemble. Once 4:30 hit, we wrapped up our rehearsal, and I quickly tore down my cymbals so I could bring them with me to our gig later in the evening. I then left the studio so I could swing back to my house, grab my drums, feed my dogs, and grab a change of clothes. It may have been smarter to just bring my drums with me earlier, but I didn't feel like leaving them in the car all day with the cold weather, and since I live so close to the studio, it was just as easy to grab them at home before making my way back over to the studio to pick up Jason on our way to the gig. The show tonight was about a half hour north in Appleton for a music series that runs every Tuesday at Stone Arch Brewery. They have a small tap room in the basement that's an intimate spot for music making, and it's a series I'm excited to play anytime I can. The curator of this series, Taylor, does an amazing job bringing in creative and new groups while keeping a consistent crowd each week. We played 2 sets from 7 to 9 p.m., and Jason's wife Kate even came up to sing a few tunes in the second set. I'll drop in a few clips from the show here, and then catch up with you after to recap the rest of the night. As our gig wrapped up, I went ahead and tore down my drums and cymbals, but stuck around to chat with some fellow musicians that showed up to listen before making my way out of the club and back onto the roads to Oshkosh. I think having the opportunity to perform this new music in front of an audience was really helpful in me getting more comfortable on some of the arrangements, and I'm sure that it's going to pay off over the next few days as we begin tracking this music. I arrived back at home around 11 p.m. and again, unpacked my drums so they wouldn't be left out in the cold overnight, but once I had them all put away, I could call it a night and get some sleep. Our call time for Wednesday was 10 a.m., so I decided to leave the house around 9:30 so I could have time to swing by a nearby cafe and grab a coffee and a breakfast sandwich. After I got my order, I made my way back to the car and got over to the studio just up the road. Once I made my way into the studio, I sat out in the live room during a quick rehearsal and ate my breakfast. Now, before anybody calls me out for not participating, this was prior to the engineer's arrival, so we couldn't get the headphone system on yet, which means if I was in the booth, I wouldn't be able to hear the other musicians. So instead, I just hung out and took some mental notes. Before we could get tracking, I did have to set up my cymbals again, but after that, and once our engineer arrived, we could get rolling into takes pretty quickly. We started with one of the most challenging tunes, Might As Well Because Love Is Hell. I always find that the first few takes are really just about getting settled into the environment and getting a feel for the balance between what you're playing and how it's translating into your headphones in the moment. I also feel that in jazz, you have about 3 to 4 takes before you get a diminishing return by playing a tune over and over again, so I think we all knew we'd need to come back to this song later. Next, we moved on to a much more straight-ahead tune called Last Night Was the Last Time. This tune is more of a relaxed jazz waltz, and we were able to capture a great recording after just a few takes. I'll drop in a clip here so you can get a feel for it. Next up was a blues that at the time of editing this video still needs a proper title, but I'll at least share the working title, Cassvin's Kelper, which is named after the inspiration for this song, along with one of my closest friends, Calvin Casper. I got to take a quick 2-chorus drum solo on this one, so I'll drop that section in here to appease all the drummers watching. Final tune before we took our lunch break, we did what I consider to be one of my favorites of this whole batch, and maybe one of the hardest, Makes My Heart Sway. It has an interesting soul jazz feel, and the form has a number of curveballs in it, so it was just challenging to find a take where we all felt like we played our best. I'll drop in this cut from the head so you can see what I'm talking about with some of the twists and turns in the form. So after a productive morning of tracking, we walked across the street to the local supper club and enjoyed some lunch, conversation, and just took an opportunity to clear our heads for an hour. Around 2 o'clock, we got back to the studio to dive in on the last half of tunes to get through. We began with a track called Darlene, and this was very much in the vintage or early jazz style. I've played this one for years with Jason and his wife in their group Kate Voss and the Hot Sauce, and they even had it arranged for big band to play with my group Water City Jazz Orchestra. It's a song that I was very familiar with, which made processing the melody and the form really easy, but it also had a new arrangement and flow to it, so I needed to get that dialed in with some of the breaks and new twist. We did some playful trading in 2-bar segments, and I think that totally captured the vintage jazz feel. Next up, we did a tune called Sittin' on a Sunset, and since we played this one on tour and had played it plenty of times over the last year, I think we were all comfortable recording it right away, but we still did a few takes in order to have a few to choose from later. We followed this track up with another 12-bar blues. This song, DK Blues, is a bit more relaxed than the previous blues we recorded, so we were able to get something we liked in just a few takes. And finally, for the last tune of the night, we did a more ballad-like tune called Second in Line. This one didn't require much out of me personally, but I love a good moving ballad that still has enough forward momentum to not feel like it's dragging on forever. We wrapped up the session around 7, and after listening back to some takes, we decided to head down the block a bit to go over to a local restaurant where there's a weekly jazz session on Wednesday nights. We grabbed some dinner and also hung out and sat in on the session. I took off a little early, around 9 p.m., so I could make my way back home to check in with my wife and get some sleep before the final day of the session tomorrow. On Thursday morning, I left the house around 9:30 again. We were asked to be at the studio at 10, but I wanted to make a stop at one of my favorite coffee shops, New Moon Cafe, to grab a coffee and a breakfast burrito. The studio was only a few blocks from here, so I pulled in around 9:45 or 9:50, and we got to work pretty quickly. By this point, we had recordings we liked of almost every song, but Jason made some notes over the tunes he'd like to try again after listening back to takes from the previous day. We started with that final tune from the previous evening, Second in Line, but in the end, we decided to stick with one of the takes from Wednesday. So the only other tune to retrack was the first from the previous day, Might As Well Because Love Is Hell. I think the thing that really made this tune challenging to capture was the solo in the middle with the guitar and piano quoting a number of famous bossa nova and samba tunes. But eventually, we did get it pretty locked in, and I'll drop in a clip of that segment to show you what I'm talking about. after taking some time to listen back to takes and eat some chili, we could call it a wrap at the studio, and I started tearing down my drums and packing everything up to take home. This was maybe around noon if I remember it correctly, but once I got home, I unpacked everything from the car and brought it all back downstairs into the basement. I didn't have too much time to spend on all of this, but I did just want to get everything put away where it belongs, so I wouldn't need to deal with it tomorrow or prolong it into the weekend. Around 2:30 p.m., Jason came to pick me up for a gig that we had this evening in Spring Green, Wisconsin, at a cool venue called Slowpoke Lounge and Cabaret. It's a spot I've played at a few times before, so I was looking forward to returning, aside from the 2.5-hour drive that awaited us to get there. A little after 5 p.m., we arrived at Slowpoke and loaded in the back door, which is conveniently right by the stage. I'm not typically a huge fan of drum risers, but the one here is subtle and allows me to be more at eye level with the other musicians while being seated, so it works well. After a quick sound check, we had some time to grab a drink and relax, and this is a great chance for me to show you how cool this spot is. Also, since they archive all of the shows here, I was able to find a cassette from a show I played earlier this year with my band, Stuck on Blue. Our show started at 7:30, and we played 2 sets until about 10 p.m. It wasn't a huge crowd, but they were extremely engaged and made us feel welcome and appreciated. I'll drop in a few clips from the show here. After we wrapped up playing, I began tearing down almost immediately, since we had a long drive ahead of us that night. I'm used to hauling around this kit multiple times a week, so I'm pretty efficient with all of this, and can usually get packed up and out the door within 15 to 20 minutes. After I got everything loaded into Jason's car, I joined my bandmates out in the lounge to talk with attendees of the show, but fairly quickly, Jason and I took off to tackle our 2.5-hour drive home. Also, I didn't grab any unloading footage from when we got back because it was so late, I was tired, and I was really ready to call it a night as quick as possible. So after a whole string of full days recording and performing, I had most of Friday to myself to get some things done at home before a quick gig later in the evening. It's December 1st, so usually at the beginning of my month, I need to record receipts that are eligible to be written off and close my books on all the revenue and activities I did during the previous month. I have a way of doing this where I'm updating a spreadsheet almost daily, but the end of the month is really the day where I'll go through and wrap up any loose ends, and then begin my prep for the next month, which includes generating and sending some lesson invoices, and putting in all of my gigs for the upcoming month, which gives me a nice perspective of what I might need to prepare for, or communicate with some other musicians about in advance. Seeing as it is December, I'll have more holiday-themed events, which in turns means a lot more music to prep and coordinate that I don't play on a regular basis throughout the year. After getting all of my office work done, I had some time to also work on a snare that I've been fixing up for a bit, and of course, that will have its own dedicated video, so I won't get into that too much here. Around 3 p.m., I needed to pack up and hit the road for my gig at a winery with my jazz trio, Stuck on Blue. The winery is just across the lake I live on, and I know that sounds like a short commute, but Lake Winnebago is the largest in the state of Wisconsin, so it takes me around 45 minutes to get over there. With this time, I usually catch up on a podcast or sports talk radio, but on this drive, I was lucky to be able to schedule a phone call with a prospective wedding client interested in hiring my band, the Pocket Kings. It's nice to make good use of this time and stay productive when possible, and it sure makes the trip go by faster. I pulled up at the winery just around 4:15 and began unloading my drums out of the car and onto my cart so I could take everything with me in a single trip. One thing that seems to stay consistent with winery gigs is that whenever I pull up, the place may be empty, but by the time we're actually set up and ready to go, there's a healthy crowd. And also, within 10 minutes of us wrapping up, it seems to begin clearing out, especially on these 5 to 8 p.m. slots. These sorts of gigs are super laid back and usually very easy to execute, but in our case, for this specific gig, our bass player's wife went into labor just 2 days prior, so leading up to this one, I was desperately calling around at the last minute looking for a sub, and no joke, I called over 25 people to sub before finding someone who was available. It was certainly stressful, but I think it speaks to the great quantity of musicians in this region who are all excellent and who I'd be happy to share the stage with. In the end, the bassist we were able to play with tonight was someone I hadn't worked with prior, and it ended up being a blessing because he was great to play with, and I hope this opportunity provides the chance for us to work together more in the future. So after 3 hours of performing, I packed up all of my cymbals, drums, and stands, and got it loaded up onto my trusty gig cart before making my way out to the parking lot and loading everything into my car. Luckily, with this being an early gig and getting done by 8 p.m., I could get on the road by maybe 8:30 at the latest and make it back home a little after 9. After 5 full days of performing, teaching, and recording, I was eager to get home, unpack, and relax for a bit. And although most musicians pride themselves on gigging through the weekend, I was very much looking forward to having the next couple days off to recoup from an exhausting but musically fulfilling week. If you've made it this far in the video, thanks for watching, and leave a comment down below to let me know your favorite part of this whole journey. Also, stay on the lookout for new music from Jason and the Jazzernauts coming out in 2024. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. And until next time, thanks.